Hey, Steve. Steve. I'm ready.
Are you ready?
Sure. You sure? I just want to tell him something. Tell the translator. I changed a few slides from yesterday. It's pretty much 90%.
Nacho, por favor. ¿Puedes decir todas las personas que están pendientes que pasen? Buenas tardes. Continuamos el Seminario Internacional. La sesión de esta tarde es fundamentalmente con traducción simultánea. Si alguien tiene algún problema, mis compañeros de la Dirección General de la Policía que nos acompañan, a los cuales damos un caluroso saludo y les damos muchísimas gracias por su trabajo, tanto ayer en Ávila como hoy. Pueden resolverlo directamente con todos vosotros. Bien, tengo el honor de presentar esta tarde al señor Thomas Neer. Thomas Neer es agente del FBI. Es agente retirado en estos momentos, pero continúa sus labores de asesoramiento dentro de la Oficina Federal de Investigaciones de Estados Unidos. Y Thomas Neer, además de ser un profesional de dilatada experiencia, es un hombre extraordinario como persona. Lo conocimos en Zamora hace 4 años, en un seminario internacional, en un congreso que celebramos en Zamora hace muy poquito tiempo, y tuvimos la ocasión de conocerle y sobre todo de entablar una entrañable amistad con él. Thomas Neer comenzó su singladura profesional en la Unidad de Investigación Naval de los Estados Unidos, en la unidad que también se conoce con el acrónimo de Identities, y posteriormente pasó a formar parte de diversas unidades de investigación en el FBI. Los últimos años de su carrera profesional los ha pasado en la Unidad de Análisis de Conducta del FBI, tanto en la parte académica, en cuántico, como en la parte operativa. Como veréis en la presentación que os va a ofrecer esta tarde, una de sus últimas misiones ha sido investigar sobre el terreno al equipo, al staff, a la estructura de Saddam Hussein. Desde luego, su experiencia profesional en el ámbito de la investigación de campo, como sus conocimientos teóricos y su experiencia también como académico, son tremendamente enriquecedoras. Thomas Neer ha tenido la grandísima amabilidad de acompañarnos esta tarde. Para él ha sido un esfuerzo importantísimo porque tiene a su madre enferma, se puso enferma súbitamente, prácticamente en el momento de subir al avión. Tuvo que gestionar los cuidados muy precipitadamente, pero a pesar de todo ello ha hecho el esfuerzo de venir. Se puso enfermo durante el vuelo, en fin, perdió el avión en Bruselas. Ha sido todo un poco un caos en su viaje, pero a pesar de ello aquí lo tenemos, y para nosotros es una gran suerte que él esté aquí con nosotros y que le podamos escuchar. Tom, welcome to Spain, welcome to Valladolid.
Muchas gracias. Hola, buenas tardes. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was in Salamanca 2 years ago lecturing, and I found it to be a wonderful experience. A very intellectual audience who had good questions, and also the staff take wonderful care of us. And speaking of having people take wonderful care of us, this is the second day that we've eaten a huge, what we would call lunch. And there's a cultural difference. In the United States, at lunch, maybe we have a salad, but we save for dinner, we eat a full meal. So yesterday we ate a full meal at around noon, my partner and I wanted to go to sleep within a couple hours. So it's very dangerous in America when you speak and lecture if you speak right after people have eaten, because then it's you hear a lot of snoring. So hopefully I will not hear that. If you're going to snore, please leave. It will give me a negative complex. Today, I want to give a couple disclaimers first. And the first one is that I am not what you would call an academic. So I'm not going to be speaking as an academic. I'm going to be speaking as a practitioner with over 30 years in the FBI and naval intelligence and in the prison system. I worked in the prison system. I wasn't an inmate. In any event, we're going to be going on a journey today, perhaps rapida, maybe very fast. I just want to cover a lot of things. You know, what's really interesting is, as an FBI agent, I worked cases for many years as an investigator, and I was assigned to Florida. I was in New York for 10 years, and then I came to the Behavioral Analysis Unit. And we get cases from all over the United States and actually all over the world. And it gives us an opportunity to sort of see a breadth of cases. Some of that may be reflected here. I'm going to show some United States cases. And the topic that I've been asked to speak on.
It's a trouble because the translator is not functioning. We need to make a little break. 2 minutes.
Different translator? Un momento, wait. Is it the same translator?
They are hearing you in English.
They what?
The people is hearing, is not hearing the translation.
Am I? Did they want me to? Hey, wait a second. Steve. Where's the on off? Hold on. Did they hear anything?
No.
Okay.
Carlos, ¿puedes hablar, por favor? ¿Sí? ¿Estás escuchando al intérprete? Perfecto. Perdón. Sorry.
Did they hear anything? Should I repeat? Should I start over?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Okay. Buenas tardes. My name is Thomas Neer, and I want to thank you for the invitation to come speak. This is an honor for me. I came to Salamanca and spoke 2 years ago about, I think, sexual homicides and other types of murder cases. And we enjoy coming, my American colleagues and I have been over here before, and we always enjoy coming to Spain. We're treated very well, and we find the audiences to be very open-minded and very intellectual, actually. So this is an honor. I want to tell you, as a disclaimer, in the beginning, that I'm speaking to you as a practitioner, not as an academic. This is my background. I've spent 30 years with the FBI. I was 5 years with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the federal prison system for 3 years. And I clarified that earlier. When I worked for the prison system, I was a staff member. I was not a prisoner. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be going through rapidly some discussion about crimes that are generated, that involve some sort of conviction. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But before I do that, I want to tell you that in my FBI career, The first half was investigating various kinds of crimes, and the second half was spent over 14 years in our behavioral analysis unit at Quantico. And I'm very familiar with all the television programs that are out there right now. Raise your hand if you have some version of Criminal Minds here in Spain. Yes? Okay. Is this the one, the Criminal Minds, where they fly on the airplane everywhere? So I want to let you know that I'm fascinated by that program too, and I wish that life worked that way when I was in BAU. But I never flew on a private jet, and I always seemed to get a seat. It was usually seat 37J by the laboratory whenever I had to travel to trips. So that's unfortunately the reality. The other unfortunate thing is that those cases on television are usually solved in an hour, and we never had that luxury. In many cases, we never solved. So as long as you understand some of those. Crimes of conviction. What I wanted to talk to you about is I'm not going to be discussing sectarian crimes for two reasons, or sectarian violence. We don't have sectarian violence per se. Although the world is full of it, we do not suffer from that problem. We have many other problems with violence in America, such as school violence, but we don't have a problem with sectarian violence, which has its own, I think, psychology to it, and very complex. So, but today, what I want to go through is when we talk about crimes of conviction, we're talking about groups. It can be individuals, it can be groups, and it's a diffuse demography. There's no one kind of person or one kind of offender in terms of age or in terms of race. There's no profile. And one of the other things that we find out is that motivations vary significantly. There's no single motivation for somebody that's going to be committing, excuse me one second. Trying to figure out how to eliminate the noise. Just a minute. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Okay, so the motivations vary, and in my experience, almost every case that comes in the door to our unit is very different. And so often, police departments that call us wanting help with a case, the first thing they want is a profile. They want some sort of a description, and I'm telling you, almost every case is different. Now, we start to see some patterns, and there's been some empirical research. One of the areas that we in America seem to have, and no one else in the world seems to have the problem we have with school violence, where we're a gun culture. It's one of the bad things about America. I will not be talking a lot about that, but I want to reference it because those kinds of crimes, I don't know that I would call those crimes of conviction necessarily. They don't involve religion or politics, but it is a big problem in America, and it involves bullying and young kids that feel like they have to get revenge by killing people. It's a huge problem. This is a huge issue for police. I mean, I think what we have, when you're talking about crimes that are driven by people's religious beliefs or political beliefs, they become very passionate. And what happens is the potential for lots of victims shows up. Also, there's pressure on the police to resolve these problems quickly because they're front page in the news. A tremendous strain on police resources. Again, where the motivations related to religion, politics, or prejudice. Now, just think about it in terms of broad categories. And we're talking about religion, new religious movements. In the old days, we used to call those cults. And the reason I put that up here is that it's still very, very interesting. When I first joined the behavioral analysis unit, some of the people that first trained me had worked on a couple of very, very interesting cases involving a case we're going to see actually in a few minutes in Jonestown, Guyana with Jim Jones. And that case, even though it's 25, 35 years ago, still has a lot of meaning today when we start looking at people and belief systems. And then we have in America, we have a tremendous amount of people who are opposed to abortion. So we have abortion clinic bombings, what we call single issue types of cases, abortion clinics, and then arson of churches. We have churches that are that are being bombed, churches that are on fire, and these are committed by people that are either opposed to the religion, or sometimes it's actually people setting fire to their own institutions for whatever reason. And then in terms of the political arena, we have militia and anti-government groups, and in the last 10 years, there's been a proliferation of what we call environmental. This is Earth First and some of the animal rights people who've really started becoming very problematic in the United States. So these are some of the ones that I would consider crimes of conviction. Now, hate crimes is fairly new in the United States. We've been investigating that just very shortly, and I'll show you some statistics later. And actually, I think that's a very, very important category of crime. I never thought that way when I first joined the FBI. But it's actually, when you start thinking about crimes of conviction, it actually begins with hate. It actually begins with misunderstanding and intolerance. And so if you can nip that in the bud, I think you can stop a lot of problems ahead of time. Now, there's three sort of guiding principles when I work in the FBI and I have to assess cases, and when I talk about, what we're talking about today, crimes of conviction. The first thing you need to know, the first of the three principles, is in America, we have, as you probably know, a distinction between the government and religion. The two do not mix. Like, for example, I used to live in the Middle East, where the religion and the government is one. But in America, we go to great lengths, good or bad, to separate church and state. And this is important because when cases are sent to us, it doesn't matter what kind of religion or what kind of politics are involved, we are going to investigate that openly. Now, sometimes people think it's very ridiculous that we separate the two, but we do that because America was founded in part because of religious persecution over in England. People escaped to come to America, and they wanted the two to be separate. So you won't find the US government funding education for religion. And in fact, when I was a young kid, we used to say in school, we would have what was called school prayer. Do you do that here? Have prayer in school? Well, we did when I was a child, but we can no longer do that in America. It's considered mixing of government schools with religion. So you now can't say a prayer in school. Interestingly, I say that, but somebody recently told me that prayer in school is still alive, and you will always see it about a half hour before examinations. That's a joke. Okay, so the second principle I wanted to mention is that we focus again on the violations of law. So whether the case could be sent to us and it has something to do with religion or politics or hate or prejudice, but what we're looking for, are there violations of law? And that's what we're looking for. It doesn't matter, again, what they're thinking. And whether it's politics or religion, it could be a fraud, it could be an arson investigation, a bombing, a murder, sexual assault, child endangerment. And the third principle is behavioral analysis. This is just one tool. This is just one tool in an arsenal available for the police to use in an investigation. And we would sometimes have too high expectations placed on the behavioral analysis unit. We're not there to replace a solid investigation. We should be an adjunct to that investigation. And some of the things that we would do was, if there's unknown offenders, perhaps we could help identify them. What kind of person would commit this crime? Or maybe somebody says, is this crime likely to happen again? Give us a threat assessment. How serious is this? Is this one-time offense or is it more? Interview strategy. Is there something about the way this crime was committed when we're going to interrogate the suspect that you can give us some pointers on how to interrogate this person? Same thing with prosecution. How do you present them in front of a jury so that you can help with the conviction? And of course, education and prevention. And again, motivation may not be readily apparent. So many times cases come to us and someone says, this crime was committed because somebody hates Catholics, somebody hates Jews. But maybe after the investigation or after we do the analysis, we find out that's not the motivation at all. It's something unrelated. So it may not be what you think it is. Now, I'm going to bring this case up and talk about it for a few minutes because it has a lot of lessons when you start talking about people that commit crimes based on convictions and beliefs. And how many people here are familiar? You should, in America, you would be familiar because every year there is a committee in California that broadcast this case about the People's Temple where there was a mass suicide. They broadcast on television. Raise your hand if you're familiar with this Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Oh boy, okay. I could spend 2 hours talking about this case, and now I'm going to spend 3 minutes and make the translator mad because I'm going to go fast. But this case was actually started over here on the far right is Jim Jones. He was a self-anointed minister who grew up in the 1960s and 70s in the middle part of the United States, and he had a very difficult childhood, as so many of these people have. And he came to California in the 70s, and he opened a church called the People's Temple. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to bring in unfortunate poor people, and most of the poor people in California at the time were African American, white of course, and Latin. And he wanted to have a church for them, and he felt like they were being abandoned. So you can imagine how well he was received in California. This was great. Here was a guy that was really interested in, it was almost a social movement, but he called himself a minister, and it was called the People's Temple. And so his congregation grew tremendously, and he started getting political attention in California. And politicians actually found that if they aligned themselves with him, they could get more votes. So he started loving the attention. But it turns out that this preacher has a dark side, and we'll see that shortly. Also, in the 1970s in California was the height of sort of a transformation in social movement. That's when the hippies were starting to come in, and so there was a lot of liberal sort of beliefs. And so there were two types of people that were drawn to him: poor people and idealists. In California, as he was starting to gain a lot of power, he started manipulating and abusing a lot of the people in the church, and he would take their whatever money they had, he would have them go work, but they would have to come back and give the money to him and the church. There were allegations of sexual abuse. There were allegations of him having people beaten if they didn't follow along. Some of these stories started getting into the newspaper, and he did not like the attention. At the same time, he had a custody dispute. There was a 5-year-old son that he wanted to keep, and it looked like he was going to lose that son. So he packed up all of his congregation. There were a couple hundred of them, and he moved to South America, in the northern part, to Jonestown, Guyana. And it looks fairly idyllic. But what happened there shocked the nation, because we all woke up. I was a child at the time. We all woke up, and we found out that there had been what we were told was a mass suicide. Can you imagine how many people? Any guesses? 900 deaths, and it was with cyanide, had been placed inside Kool-Aid. I don't know what the equivalent is here. And this is what people found when they came there, all these people. And at first, it looked like they had all drank it willingly, but as time unfolded, it comes out that he had people in his group who were forcing mothers, babies, husbands, forcing them to inject this stuff. What he had done is he had grown very, very paranoid. He was a very charismatic leader, and over time, he turned that charisma in a very negative way, in a way that would control people, and he did not like people disagreeing with him. So like so many of you who've read about cults, you had a charismatic leader who monopolized their time. He monopolized his time by making everybody work, and when you're working, you don't have time to think. So he monopolized their thought by telling them what the reality of the world was. And when people would disagree with his religion or politics, he would have them punished. So there was a suspension of critical thinking, and people in the congregation, once they had been brought in and good things had been done for them, found it difficult to leave. Some of them because of fear, and some of them because of cognitive dissonance. You know, they spend all of this time and money telling everybody how great he is and joining it, and now there's some problems. To leave is to sort of admit to themselves they've made a mistake. So in a sense, a very, very clever, manipulative leader knows how to kind of keep you around, either by fear or by your own worry about leaving, being inconsistent with the beliefs that you've adopted. And this type of phenomena has actually, in different forms, we've seen this with terrorist groups as well. Now there's a big trend, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, of lone offenders who aren't affiliated with groups and being exposed like this, at least directly. Maybe they're getting some of this on the internet. But still, some of the principles that we learned here are interesting. One of the things that happened with his paranoia, I'm going to show you a picture of him. That's different from the picture you saw when he was with the kids. This is like a day before he died. The paranoia was so great that what he would do is, it appeared that he knew in advance that he was going to take everyone's life and his. So what he would do is he would call members of his congregation together and tell them the government's out to get us. They're all out to get us. And he convinced the people of this, and he said, we need to kill ourselves. And they actually had rehearsals of all drinking what they were told at the time was poison, and most of the people drank it. And as it turns out, it was just fruit juice. It wasn't a poison. And this was a loyalty test for him. He could find out who was on his side and who was not. But think of the power that that gave him of life and death over people. Well, those rehearsals were called the White Nights. And of course, when this final death came about, some of the people thought that maybe the drink didn't have poison in it, only to find out, unfortunately, that it did. He used to sit there up above the congregation in this seat, and it says, those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. We've all heard that. And so I throw that out here because even though this is a case that's very historic, it has meaning to us today. We should always think about this, because when people are driven by political or religious causes, sometimes they get so entrenched and they can't pull away, and they can't find a way to pull themselves back out, and they lose sight. So again, the lessons learned here was the power of a charismatic leader, the degree of his egocentricity. He used to pretend like he had revelations and miracles, but they were all staged. Like one time he said, I'm going to pull the cancer out of someone's head. But really he had just gone to the store and bought a piece of chicken liver and concealed it in his hand. But some of the people just wanted to believe this so badly. So when we talk about people that are drawn to the crimes of or organizations with their strong conviction, part of the problem are the people that run these organizations, and the other part are the people that need to be affiliated with them. So it's two sides of the same coin. The capacity for deception was huge, and easily can manipulate people who want to be led, in a sense. And then the compelling needs of the followers, the surrender, the denial, acceptance, and in many cases, collusion. There were people who survived, who were among the 900 that survived because they had actually colluded. They knew what was going to happen, and they ran into the jungle and hid. And some of them are living with guilt. A couple have committed suicide. And there's still today some public misunderstanding about that. Now, let's move forward, and we go to Waco. Now, we're talking about a movement a minute ago, that People's Temple. They weren't out to change the world. And what happened there was almost sort of like a defense against what they saw as outside intervention. And this is what we saw with another religious group in Texas, one of our southern states, where there was a group called the Branch Davidians. And this was the leader of them. Again, it's a long line of sort of self-anointed ministers. He didn't get any real training in a school of divinity. He just woke up when he was in his teenage years and decided that he would start preaching. And eventually he worked his way into being the head of a group called the Branch Davidians. The problem was that with so many of these small religious or political groups, there's infighting and jealousy. And there were people that he was competing with to be the title, the head of this group. And so they started fighting, and that led him to purchase weapons. And when you purchase weapons, you go back to my slide, the second principle, which was, we don't care what your religion is about. It can be good, it can be bad, it can be nutty. We care the fact that you're violating the law. So the law enforcement went to arrest him for the weapons violations, and he shot and killed 4 law enforcement officers. The FBI came, and there was a standoff. And in that standoff, negotiations went on for 45, 50 days. And at the end of 50 days, David Koresh kept stalling. He kept coming up with reasons. First, he said, I'll come out of my compound and surrender, but I've got 80 women and children in here with me. So law enforcement did not want to storm in because they were worried innocent lives would be taken. But after about 50 or 60 days, there was a lot of talk that this guy would never come out. They had plenty of food to last them a year. So the decision was made to put tear gas into the compound. But the FBI didn't want to walk up close to the building and shoot the tear gas in because they would be shot. So they decided to use a tank and put the tear gas in the tank and roll the tank up next to the building. But this guy, who tried to look like Jesus Christ, said, I see a tank coming, this is the apocalypse. And so they start setting fires inside their own compound, and presto, 80 of them die in a fire that was absolutely dreadful. And a couple of my FBI friends, this is before I came to the BAU, were down there, and they were trying to tell the tactical people, the FBI, don't use that tank. That's going to scare this guy. And the tactical people said, he's just stalling. And the behavioral people said, but you have to treat like this differently. He's a little bit paranoid. So again, we're getting some insight into how these people think. Now, there was allegations after this event. This was in Waco, Texas. There was allegations after this that the FBI set the fire. That was not true. When you shoot tear gas into a location, it's not supposed to be flammable, but in some cases it is. Nobody in the FBI wanted to kill people. But when they thought that they were under attack, they set fires. We had actually planes overhead that could read what was called forward-looking infrared radar. You could see where the fires were being set. Waco becomes a huge issue for anti-government people in the United States, and other crimes are committed because of Waco over the next 10 years. Now, this was just recently. No religion is sacred in the United States. This is a Sikh temple in Wisconsin that was attacked by this guy who killed 13 people and then he shot himself. Not a lot of this guy didn't know the difference in a Muslim and a Sikh. And so now we're talking mental issues. But initially people thought this is somebody that can't stand Sikhs. He had a bad experience in India. But actually, as it turns out, that's not the case at all. Anders Breivik, I think the world was stunned by his activities over in Norway. Very, very interesting person. And I would have to say that even though his main complaint was about the browning, as it were, you know, the influx of Muslims into Norway and Scandinavia was his so-called issue, I would dare to say that there were mental health problems and a host of other problems, so that maybe on the surface, it looked like this was a political cause, but actually, at 33 years old, he had spent over 3 years planning this thing, elaborate planning, very, very mission-oriented. I mean, you can tell just by the way he's dressed for this. Multiple weapons. He had tried to get weapons in Prague, and he had taken all the seating out of his vehicle, hoping to get weapons and take them back to Norway, but he was unable to do that. But it shows that the level of planning that this guy went through for this. A strategic thinker, and he wrote a manifesto, a huge manifesto, which is what we see with a lot of people with these convictions. Psychiatrists call it an overvalued idea. They use this term, refers to people who grab onto an idea like a pit bull, and they can't let go of it. And this becomes the defining sort of point and passion of their lives. You know, on a very personal, a friend of mine was hospitalized about 5 years ago with bulimia. And actually, one of the more psychoanalytic views on that is self-destruction, but it also has to do with an overvalued idea. The overvalued idea being skinny and not being fat is being attractive. And of course, we have a whole Madison Avenue and a whole culture that feeds into that sort of thinking and into that overvalued idea. But again, when you look at his background, he was doing internet searches right after 9/11 on his computer. So immediately after 9/11, that sort of galvanized him, gave him some ideas. He borrowed an idea for the bomb from another terrorist bombing in the United States. He had his history of no empathy, a very erratic childhood, very abusive mother. Paranoid personality was one of the diagnoses. The other one was narcissism. But his mode of attack and the amount of planning and the mission was very similar to some of these the top two are school shootings, mass school shootings in America. And the third just happened a month ago at the Washington Navy Yard, where a guy with a delusional disorder just went in and started shooting people. So what we learn is that there are people that can simultaneously have delusional disorders and schizophrenia, but still have the capacity to think and plan and become sort of mission-oriented. I'll go over this real quick. I'm just talking about terrorism and mindsets. And many times we start thinking about terrorist groups as being bigger than life. But this was a group, that Jamaat Islam Shahi, I'll call it JIS, right? This was actually formed by the guy on the right in prison. He's a high school, not even a high school graduate, and he's a bank robber, and he's in Folsom Prison in California with nothing but time on his hands, and he writes this religion, and he recruits prisoners who are getting ready to be released and tells them to go to a mosque, recruit more people. I want to target and kill government workers and Jews. That's what he wanted to do. So to make money, they were robbing gas stations. And as it turns out, one of the people they recruited was a Pakistani kid who was 22 years old who had just come to America. And this is what we see a lot. We see a lot of this in some of our attacks in America with terrorism in particular, is what we call competing identities. Young people whose identity is torn between two cultures. Am I a Pakistani and am I an American? Now, he's living in America and he's going to an American university, but all the values he's been taught, they don't seem to make sense. He's going to a college in California, and he writes in a diary, he can't understand all these women that he's been told, stay away from women until you get married. But he sees all these American women running around in shorts, and he can't figure that one out. And there's many other things he's having trouble with. So he joins that group, and ultimately, they get caught. But again, here was a group that people have thought, this is really driven by ideology. No, it's driven by a bank robber with time on his hands. And now we had another case. This was Hasan Akbar. This was a guy who was a military, where are we, 15 minutes? Half. This was a, Hasan Akbar was a US Army soldier, here's his picture, in Kuwait, right after the first Gulf War. America was staging many of their troops next to Iraq in Kuwait. Kuwait allowed the US military to build up forces there. Hasan had been in the army for about 2 years. When he was in Kuwait, one night he decided to take some hand grenades and roll them underneath a tent, and when their officers inside the tent got blown up. And there were some survivors, and as the survivors ran out of the military tent, Akbar was there with a rifle to shoot. So he ended up killing 2 and wounding 14. And so immediately everybody said, Akbar was a Muslim, that's why he did this. And in fact, when he was convicted, that's what was said during the trial. But I saw it a little bit differently, because I was asked to review a diary that he had kept for 14 years. Now, apart from the fact that I'm a slow reader, it took me 14 months, it took me a long time to get through it. What I saw was 99% inadequacies about this young man. Horrible family background, horrible abusive background. And the entire diary are full of recriminations about himself. I'm a failure, people don't love me, girls don't understand me, guys hate me. And it was one page after another of this sort of self-loathing. In the last few months of his life in Kuwait, imagine a guy like this who feels so inadequate and so self-conscious. What's the worst place you can put somebody like that? Because he had lived alone. Put him with a group of people is bad enough, because now all of his problems are going to be magnified in front of other people. That's the worst, right? But then you put him in front of army people. Army people who don't want to be overseas. Army people who are young and immature and who pick on him and bully him. And so one of the last entries in his diary is, I don't want to go into Iraq and kill Muslims. I would rather kill my mates, which is what he does. And so at the trial, they say this was all driven by ideology. But I actually beg to differ. Now, Najibullah Zazi, this is a different sort of terrorism. Again, remember, there's no single profile. This guy was selling hot dogs in lower part of Manhattan, and he decided that he didn't fit in America, and he wanted to go over, he wanted more excitement in his life, so he went to Pakistan with two friends of his and went through a terrorist training camp. And in that training camp, he was taught how to build bombs. And he came back to the United States. He moved from New York to Colorado because he needed space to build bombs. It's very hard building a bomb in Manhattan without somebody seeing you. But if you go out to Colorado, it's much easier. And so we tested some of these things. And he and his mates who stayed back in New York were all going to get together and bomb subways in New York City. And his name came up on the radar screen. The British intelligence had actually arrested a terrorist, and they searched his computer, and on the computer they saw an email from the British guy to Zazi. And they said, hey, this guy Zazi looks interesting. So the FBI started looking at him, and then we developed information from there to help us prevent these attacks. But we didn't know about this beforehand. Again, a little bit about competing identities, a real failure in life, actually, with this guy. All the people in his family tried to help him, including lying. So we convicted his father. It wasn't like we were mean-spirited, but by putting charges against his father during the interrogation, we were able to say, you know, we understand you like killing Americans. We get that. We understand the training you got. We're not trying to argue with you. But what kind of man are you to let your father go to jail and your mother? And that's when you saw emotion with this guy. And that's when you started getting cooperation. So it's killing people's fine, but being dishonorable to your family, see, that's something, they have their own weird sort of code about that kind of thing. And again, what we see with radicalization, and I see that John Horgan is supposed to speak, I don't know if he's coming or not, but an incredible psychologist is going to talk about the psychology of terrorism. And one of the things that he actually studied over and lived in Northern Ireland before he came to America. And he'll tell you that, you know what, there's no profile of a terrorist. In fact, there's no single pathway to becoming a terrorist. He actually separates the whole process, what he calls a dialectical process, into three groups. There's becoming a terrorist, and there's different ways people become terrorists, and different reasons. There's no single reason. Some people say it's poverty. Some people say it's hatred of America. Some people say it's hatred of Jews. And so all these things you hear a lot of times in some of the narratives from the jihadists. But there's different reasons altogether. And then there's being a terrorist. Let's say somehow you've decided to become a terrorist in some way, shape, or form. And now somebody's put a stamp on you and you're a terrorist. What does that actually mean? For some people, it means nothing. They just go home and tell everybody, I'm a terrorist. Or maybe they don't tell people they're a terrorist. For other people, meaning a terrorist means, now I got to go kill people. Actually, it's just a minority of people like that. Some people, when they become a terrorist, think, oh, I can get to play with weapons. I can go away from home. I can be important. There's no really one thing that means. And then leaving terrorism. One of the things I was able to do these last couple years was to go into different countries. I was like in Indonesia and talk to some of the surviving Bali bombers. And from Jemaah Islamiyah, it's based in Indonesia, an Al-Qaeda group, and sort of get an insight into their mindsets, because what they're trying to do is establish programs around the world, what they call sort of counter-narrative programs. What they're saying is, somehow terrorists got radicalized. So wait a minute, instead of putting them in jail, maybe we need to, the term initially was de-radicalize them. Let's undo what was done. Well, then people said, well, we don't even know what radicalization is, so how can you de-radicalize somebody? And radicalization, you can be radical but not violent. You can be radical and an extremist but not a criminal. So what are these programs all about? So what we found in our research was that actually a better term is disengagement. Disengaging from terrorism as opposed to de-radicalization. And what we found is the process of disengagement that works the most, if these countries that are talking to us are being honest, the ones that work the most are ones where you have sort of a family working for a year or 2 years with an individual. And you're looking at this person from a psychological lens, you're looking at them through a social lens, you're looking at them through a religious lens, because maybe the family has been enablers. And so you need to get the family involved. Or maybe the reason this person joined a terrorist group was because they had no identity in their family. And that's the problem. So maybe you have to find that for them. So by looking at some of these programs to help disengage people, we're learning a little bit more about reasons that people join them. And what we find are some of the radicalizing influences are dispositional factors. Remember, think about Anders Breivik, the Norwegian guy. Dispositional factors, we had some serious mental health and family history issues, but then situational. He's living in a country that he sees the demography is changing, and that's bothering him. And outside influences. You know, one of the things we learned from suicide bombers, like in Chechnya, for example, the motivation for the suicide bombers in Chechnya is different from the motivation of suicide bombers in Gaza. And one of the differences is in Chechnya, in Gaza, and in Palestine, there's a culture. It's celebrated. There are streets named after people. There's concerts in the name, charity concerts for female suicide bombers, Wafa Idris. They have an annual concert. They have billboards. You know, like when you go to children's rooms in America, you see sports figures. But actually in Gaza, you'll see suicide bombers on the walls of teenagers. So there's a culture of suicide martyrdom, they call it. They don't even call it suicide terrorism because that's haram in Islam. They call it martyrdom operations. But in Chechnya, it's different. You're talking about a country where basically you take any war in America, any of the American wars, at worst, 0.5% men were killed, right? In wars, Vietnam War, World War II, World War I, Civil War. But now you look at Chechnya and the Russians coming into Chechnya with the breakaway republic, and the estimates of somewhere between 18 and 30% of the male population decimated. What does that do to the women's view of safety and security? What does that do to the women's view of fairness and of life and of your assumptions that it's a good world? Those assumptions are turned upside down, and people and these women couldn't get their hands around it. They couldn't get their arms around this tragedy. And so they're suffering loss. There wasn't one family, in some of the research that was done over there by Ann Speckard, some of the research showed that there wasn't one family in Chechnya that didn't lose a male, at least one male family member. And so your whole view of the world changes. And now you become susceptible to messages from the incoming Islamists saying, it's terrible, and the only way to stop it is to blow yourself up. So you had women volunteering, because they had nothing left to lose, to become suicide bombers. And they called them the Black Widows. That's what the media jumped on that. But really, it's because their world got turned upside down. And it was more than just feeling badly and losing a loved one. When you sustain that degree of loss, you have what's called a dissociative reaction. It's a mental breakdown. And in that dissociative reaction, it made sense for somebody to say, here, strap this thing on. We share the same enemy. And they would be volunteering. And you wouldn't even have to train these people. They would go in and blow up places right away. So again, outside influences, and I was talking about vicarious victimization or direct victimization. Grievances, humiliation, the way people treated, and for some people, just excitement, boredom. Some of the young men that join these, and it's mostly men, although we're seeing more women join, I have to tell you, you can see this. Boredom, money, anger, humiliation, revenge is very, very big. Revenge either for their family or revenge for themselves. I have to tell you about a female suicide, not a suicide bomber, a woman in America that people thought may be a suicide bomber. And her name surfaced in an FBI investigation. They said, this woman is a terrorist and she's very radical and we need to go take a look at her. So I can't tell you a lot of the details, but basically the FBI got enough probable cause to go to the court. In America, we just can't put a wiretap on someone's telephone. We have to get authorization by the court. And to get authorization, we have to show that there's a reason. And we're accountable that that reason is accurate. And so the reason was that we believed that she was having conversations through the email and over the phone with known terrorists. So then when we got the court order to listen, she spoke full English and was learning Arabic. When we reviewed all that, when you were to listen to this woman, you would say, my God, she is going to be the next 9/11 single-handedly. 5 minutes? She's going to be the next 9/11 single-handedly. We actually went over to her house, and when you were to look at her, she just looked like a 17-year-old dopey college girl, like anyone's daughter, sister. And on one side of her bed was every jihad book on how to kill people. And all the emails, it was scary. What was on the other side of the bed? Books on cars, books on dresses, how to get a boy's attention. I mean, it was unbelievable. The juxtaposition was absolutely unbelievable. So again, I mean, who are these people and what influences? And no surprise that the parents were pretty much absent in her life and had no idea what she was sort of doing. I'm going to speed up and just go right into something about hate groups real quick. In America, I think it's a very good idea that we have now added hate crimes to our repertoire. And if I can find it, here it is. Okay, this last 5 minutes. Last year in 2011, we had over 6,000 hate crimes. Now, the majority of them were race, and then the next majority were religion, and then from there, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and victims. And what was really, I think, the most surprising is, and this has been consistent over the last 4 years, actually, there's some of the Ku Klux Klan, they can't stand African Americans, again, some of the skinhead groups right there, and again, gay bashing in America. But this is what the research found. Actually, most of the people were not committed haters. You know, not too many people are born to hate. What we found was 60% are just doing it for fun. It was a thrill. That really surprised some of the researchers. Defensive, 25% to protect their neighborhood from an outsider. There was intolerance. They looked at the other person, we call it the other, demonizing other people, looking at somebody who's different, calling them names, and demonization. Once you, and social psychologists have told us this for years, and it's a trick that terrorist groups use. Once you can identify an enemy, first thing is you do, then what you do is you project blame onto that enemy. They're responsible for everything bad. And then after that, you demonize them. You label them, you use negative characterizations, and you demonize them and dehumanize them. Once you dehumanize them, then it's easy to kill them because you're not killing a person. You're killing a Jew, you're killing an infidel. So that's the trick that they use in all these things. And hate is where this begins. So I think that, you know, countries, you know, like America and perhaps your country, when you start focusing early on hate crimes, I think you start to see the seeds of what later in the continuum would be sectarian violence, if you could stop it early on. And we looked at the Muslims after 9/11. Who do you think? Americans. You know, I can think of all great things in my country, but we got a lot of problems and a lot of bad people. And after 9/11, we had our own people who were hating Muslims. And now there were crimes, hate crimes against Muslims, 157. We believe it's probably 5 or 10 times greater than that. It was highly underreported. It's like sexual crimes. We believe it's highly underreported in America. So I'm finished right now. If we have a minute left, I'll entertain any questions. Yes? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay.